Okay, so section 11, how is what capitalist liberal democracies were fighting for different from what communists were fighting for? And this is where we had this really long kind of PPT I had for you. So if you look up capitalist liberal democracy, right, there's this idea of free ownership of property, right? This is more important than productivity. I kind of gave you that example earlier. So there's this idea that we want people to own their own land, their own property, because they'll take better care of it. If they get the profits from working hard, they're more likely to invest more in their business, in their farm, right? Which will lead to greater wealth for everyone, right? If farmers are growing a lot of food because they can make money from growing more food, well, that benefits all of us because then we have access to more food. In communism, though, there's an emphasis on state ownership of property in order to make sure that property is equally distributed so that everyone has enough, right? Remember I gave you that example in China. In traditional Chinese communism, there was no unemployment. Everyone had a job. It was often a boring, terrible job, but they guaranteed that you would be able to make a living, right? So they chose that over efficiency, over productivity. They want to make sure everyone can make a living. In capitalist liberal democracies, the economy is run by the market, right? The economy is run by the market, mostly. But in communism, the economy is run by the state, mostly. There's always exceptions. It's more of an emphasis. But the idea, again, is because capitalist liberal democracies think markets bring more productivity. In communism, the state is needed because it will make sure that the economy is run in a way that will benefit most people. Now, for capitalist liberal democracy, both agree that democracy is great. Communists will talk about bringing true democracy. Capitalist liberal Democrats will talk about bringing true democracy, but they understood democracy as meaning different things. Right? For capitalist liberal democracies, democracy means voting. For communism, democracy means doing the will of the people. Right? So those are different kinds of things. Capitalist liberal democracy, state is guided by the will of the people made known through voting. Communists would look at that and say, well, who wins the elections? It's rich people who can afford to campaign, who can spend a lot of money on their campaigns. That's who wins elections. Right? However, communists then would argue that the state should be guided by communist doctrine, which will in the end serve the good of the people. Right? So in capitalist liberal democracy, the idea is you know what the people want through voting. In communism, the state knows what the people need because they know through communist doctrine what should be done. Capitalist liberal democracies argue that the state should guarantee human rights of the people, often through written constitution, bills of rights. That's classical liberalism. Whereas communism, there's this idea that human rights can be sacrificed for the good of the revolution. Right? Rich people use freedom and rights in order to control the economy, in order to oppress the poor, so we're not going to allow them to do that anymore. We're going to take away those wealthy people's freedom because they're using that so-called freedom to oppress the poor. In CLDs, the state can tolerate non-state institutions, private schools, churches, NGOs, right? If you give money to a private school, you give money to a church, you give money to the American Heart and Lung Association, you can take a tax write-off. You understand those things make the state stronger, right? In communism, though, the state must eliminate or dominate non-state institutions because they fundamentally pose a threat. So how did the Soviet Union act immediately after World War II and why? How did the capitalist liberal democracies respond, particularly seeing the policies of containment and the Marshall Plan? And my hint is remember the mules in Greece. So remember, the Soviet Union lost massive amounts of people in World War II. Their desire then was to maintain their own security. How do we avoid not losing 20 more million people? And also to make the world safe for communism. And their solution was to try and expand communism. They did this in two ways, either by annexing territory forcibly, just making it a part of the Soviet Union, but also they would establish communist governments in Eastern Europe in places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Those had been capitalist liberal democracies before World War II, but the Soviet Union, in order to spread communism, to ensure their own security, the security of the worldwide communist revolution, is going to force those governments to become communist governments after the war. And they could do that because they got soldiers there, right? Because they put the soldiers there to kick out the Nazis. Most people in those countries did not want communism, but they're forced to accept it. This freaks out the capitalist liberal democracies. We see communist expansion as a threat to our security and our ideals, right? They kind of made this clear because they're forcing countries that did not want communism to become communists. However, we're afraid of another world war. So that really severely limits our possibilities, right? We can't, though, appease because we're afraid that, that's what people did with Hitler, right? We can't invade because that could start another world war. But we can't appease because people did that with Hitler, and then Hitler just, started World War II, and that caused a lot of problems, a lot of death and suffering. So the argument is we need to prevent the spread of communism. And two places to do that would be in Greece, where there's a civil war over communism, and also in Turkey, where the Soviet Union is trying to spread its power, get access to ship out Iranian oil, and so forth. So Harry Truman will develop the policy of containment, which is the idea of we're not going to invade countries that are already communist. We're going to, however, try and prevent the spread of communism, right? We're going to try and stop it from spreading further. And we will provide financial and military aid to anyone who's facing the threat of that communist expansion. Connected to this then is the Marshall Plan, which is basically giving money and loans to Europeans so they can rebuild their country. The idea being that poor people are more likely to become communists because communism emphasizes equality. If you're poorer than most people, you want equality because that will make you wealthier. But if we help them rebuild their farms and businesses, if we show that capitalism can make them wealthy and that liberal democracy will give them the freedom to enjoy their wealth, then they won't become communists, right? So the idea is that we rebuild European economies, that will help us to fight communism. And of course, I just want to stress that this wasn't simply, us giving them stuff. They had to pay some of this back, and we expected Europeans to buy like John Deere tractors and things from American companies. And I gave you an example of this in Greece. Remember, that's where the Greeks were given mules. And the Greeks, remember there was those Greek farmers, they had lost many of their animals during the Civil War. And the idea is that if we give them mules, they can rebuild their farms, they can recover economically, and as property owners, they'll be anti-communist. On the other hand, if we don't help them rebuild their farms, they lose their farms and lose all their property, they're more likely to become communists. So that's the idea there. And of course, remember that Greek gentleman at the end said, "Long live America," right? Greeks would look to the United States rather than the Soviet Union as hope for their future. Okay, we had this question, what was MAD? Why is it important? So MAD literally means mutually assured destruction. You do want to remember that acronym. It means mutually assured destruction. And the idea that is if two countries having nuclear weapons were to fight each other, they would eventually use nuclear weapons. They'd either use them at the beginning, or when one side started losing, it would use nuclear weapons and the other side would use them. And once you start throwing nuclear weapons around, no one wins, right? Nuclear weapons are so destructive of people and property that even if you win the war, you would basically have nothing, right? So that's why countries today want to join the nuclear club, because in all of history, no countries that both have possessed nuclear weapons have ever fought each other, because mutually assured destruction, right? No one would win the nuclear war. What were the characteristics of decolonization? So remember, World War II had been fought in part against Axis aggression. And so the United States and other countries said, we're coming for liberation. And people in Africa and Asia who were colonized said, well, that's great. We would also like to be liberated. And also, of course, imperial countries like France and Britain became weaker, and it was more difficult for them to control their big empires. So essentially, this is going to encourage colonial independence movements. So just as more Africans, more Asians want to be independent, Western powers are less able to keep them as colonies, so they're going to become independent. However, while ending formal control, Western imperial countries will often seek to maintain informal influence. So for example, the United States will make sure, even though we will voluntarily leave the Philippines, we will make sure that before we leave, we negotiate trade deals that favor us, right? Unequal trade deals that favor us. And Europeans will do the same thing in Africa and Asia, as well as the US. So the problem is, colonial countries, even though they become independent, often lack the modern economic base and educated population to avoid continued dominance, right? Even though they become independent, they're often still poor. Oftentimes they still have a lack of educated people, and that was partially because of the colonial period. How can they then deal with these huge, gigantic countries like Germany or Japan or the United States, which are much wealthier and more powerful? Now, I want to give an example, though, of times that they could do this. And you can see this in the Suez Canal crisis. So the Suez Canal crisis I mentioned first and foremost because that's an example of a country that had been colonized, Egypt, being able to become strong, right? And being able to use the politics of the day to its own advantage, right? So remember, the Suez Canal, right, just so we recall, this is a canal in Egypt that connects the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Ships going through there save a lot of time, which also, of course, saves money. And this had been owned by the French and the British, right? This had been opened by the French and the British, right? But it was on Egyptian land. So Gamal Nasser, this Egyptian leader, a proponent of Arab nationalism and socialism, right? So he's already kind of mixing together things. He's not a capitalist liberal believer in capitalist liberal democracy. He's also not a believer in communism. He takes what he thinks is good. He is going to seize the Suez Canal, right? He's going to take it over. And what's amazing about this is there's all these different countries involved, right? The United States, France, Great Britain, Israel, and the Soviet Union. And what he does is he gets them to kind of compete against each other, right? So, the French and the British and the Israelis invade Egypt, but he's able to use that politically to get the United States to tell them to back off. And then he also gets the Soviets to sell him guns when we won't sell them to him. So the key thing is this guy knows how to politically get these different powers to compete against each other, so he wins. Right? The British and French and the Israelis are forced to withdraw, and he gets the Suez Canal. Right? So even though his country is weaker than France and Britain, he's able to outmaneuver them politically using the kind of Cold War politics. Right? So it is possible for the tail to wag the dog. What was the Green Book? Why was the issue of civil rights significant internationally? Why was it successful? What role did democracy play in it? What economic changes did it lead to? So remember, the Green Book was this book targeted to African Americans that told them where it was safe to travel. Right? For example, if an African American family wanted to take a vacation and they had to drive through Phoenix, Arizona, out of the 100 hotels, there were only like 8 that would actually serve African Americans. And you don't want to be late at night trying to find a hotel, especially when there's only a 10% chance that it will accept you. So this book listed those things, right? And it's kind of troubling. This shows, the difficulties African Americans face, because you'll see at the top it says assured protection for the Negro traveler, right? So for an African American to enjoy this scene, they would need someone to kind of be their protector, right? They need information because there's people out there who want to hurt them, who want to discriminate against them. And the question that I raised was, African Americans had long been struggling for civil rights. Why are they finally successful in the 50s and 60s? And I use this picture to kind of show us that, because there's Martin Luther King, and there's some his supporters, which includes not only African Americans, but also whites, especially those white nuns there. And to the right, you see the fallout sign. And I argue it's the Cold War that helps lead to the civil rights movements to finally be successful. That's the international aspect. Remember, because the Soviet Union was criticizing the United States actively for its treatment of African Americans. This was internationally embarrassing, but this was also done within the Soviet Union. Right? That's a poster aimed at Soviet Union people, saying, look at how the Americans, they claim to be for freedom, but it's only the freedom to oppress African Americans. This, of course, also made relations with African countries particularly difficult. And there's this kind of, basically this question, how can we spread democracy and keep our people happy under these circumstances? Remember, the Cold War is not a shooting war for the most part. The United States and Soviet Union never fight each other. It's a competition to see whose system will be able to make people happy, to give them material goods, and to give them freedom. Right? Which system is best at doing that? And in the end, who can keep faith in their system? Martin Luther King then is able to utilize this favorable historical context. He uses this tactics of nonviolent civil disobedience to reveal the violence that maintains this racist system. Right? And I use that picture there. You just have these African American workers holding these signs that just assert that they're human beings who should be treated with dignity. And you see the military out pointing bayonets at them, which seems to me to be totally unnecessary, right? What are those guys going to do? Right, they're unarmed, but these soldiers are armed. Why do they have to point their bayonets? And you can see the armored personnel carriers behind them. And abuses like this are televised, and a lot of white Americans and other Americans become sympathetic to African Americans and the difficulties they're facing because they're seeing it on television, in newspapers. So they will begin to support the civil rights movement. And that's why I always make a big deal, right? There's that white guy with the tie who doesn't have a sign. I think he joined spontaneously. He said, what's happening to African Americans is wrong. And I want to be a part of trying to make it right. And the key system that is democracy allows change. And that's kind of the key point I'm trying to make. One reason why the capitalist liberal democracies win the Cold War, it's not because we're perfect. We aren't. It's because democracy will allow us to deal with the problems we face successfully. And successfully enough that people will maintain hope in the system. And so this works to a large degree. It's not, our country is not perfect in this regards by any means. But you do have these real legal changes that make life better for African Americans and allow for the rise of a black middle class. So in contrast, what problems did the communists face? And I use the example of jeans and ice boxes to help us to understand these problems. So first of all, remember, the communists were economically behind the capitalist liberal democracies. The people were told that if they sacrificed their freedom in the short run, they did what the government told them to do, because communism was true. In the end, they would catch up to the capitalist countries, then overcome them economically, and once that was done, wealth would be equally distributed, and then they would enjoy perfect freedom. Right? So the communists said, sacrifice your freedom in the short term, deal with economic difficulties in the short term, but because we had the right doctrine, we will eventually overtake those capitalists. The problem is that never happened, right? They stayed relatively poor to the capitalists. They didn't get their freedom. When they tried to change, the Soviet Union might invade them, such as Hungary, Czechoslovakia. And a big part of this has to do with the fact that the Soviet Union tried to control, and most communist countries tried to control the economy. They told people what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom to produce it. And that's very inefficient, right? It works when you're just trying to build tanks and airplanes and factories and things like that. It does not work otherwise, right? As the economy becomes more complex, it does not allocate resources efficiently, right? It does not allocate resources efficiently. It cannot produce enough because it does not allocate resources efficiently. So there's lots of shortages. They were never good, for example, at producing enough shoes for everyone. And when you have a shortage of good, that often leads to corruption. I run the shoe factory. You want shoes, you need to be close to me. You need to be my buddy, you need to give me money, you need to bribe me, and so forth. So they failed to produce adequate, high-quality consumer goods. The Soviet Union was good at making sure people were well-fed. People did not starve to death in the Soviet Union. They had housing, not great housing, but they had housing. They could get what they needed, but not what they wanted. And they knew that people in the West, the capitalist liberal democracies, were getting what they wanted, right? And we can see that in the kitchen debate, right? Khrushchev is confronted by the American kitchen with its icebox or refrigerator, with its washing machine, with its color TV as well. And he says, oh, we can beat you on this, but everyone knows it's false, right? And I think what was particularly striking was a video we watched about jeans, right? That Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries tried to actually ban jeans. They said that jeans are a symbol of Anglo-Saxon imperialism and are bad and negative. And this is just silly, right? You know your system's in trouble when a pair of pants threatens it, right? We have to control people's lives so much we can't even allow them to have jeans. So what led to the fall of the Soviet Union? Well, Gorbachev wanted to try and reform communism to catch up with the West. So unlike the Chinese, he will engage in political and economic reform at the same time. And what happens is then people just say, well, why would we try and save communism? Let's just become like the capitalist liberal democracies. Their system's working. Why try and save the system that is not working well, right? So what's going to happen then is the Eastern European communist countries and the Soviet republics are going to become independent. None will remain communism. The whole system just falls apart, right? No one believes in it more. They lose faith. They say capitalist liberal democracy is clearly superior. Let's become like them. What caused the pro-democracy protests at Tiananmen? How did the Chinese Communist government deal with them? So remember that we had those protests, and what I have to emphasize, it was economic. The major causes were economic. There was uneven economic development, there was unemployment and corruption. That led students to call for liberal democracy. So what the communist government learned was, we can stop calls for liberal democracy by making people wealthy. Don't try and just oppress people. People want democracy, not simply because they like democracy, but because they think it will bring them economic benefits. If we give them economic benefits, they won't call for democracy, and the Communist Party can stay in power. The Chinese government, of course, dealt with this protest by suppressing it, possibly killing hundreds, perhaps thousands of students and the other people who joined them. So that answers all the questions people have on